Good afternoon, all, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ian Manzi, and I serve as the Program Manager at the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues at Georgetown University. It is a true honor to welcome you all to this important conversation. As people are joining us, we'll be introducing the speakers shortly, but in the meantime, I would like to let everybody know that the speakers will be taking part in a dialogue for the first half of the conversation, and we will open up the space for Q&A and questions and answer with the audience. Anybody who has a question and would like to submit it, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom. We will read out the question and have one of the panelists answer it as we go along. You're welcome to send in your questions anytime, and we'll take time to answer them as they come in. Before we begin, I would like to invite us all to pause for a moment of silence to remember the more than 1 million lives that we lost during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, including an estimated 300,000 children. In this moment, I would like us to take a moment wherever we are to think and honor and value and respect the memory of those we lost and those we'll be talking about today in this important conversation. Thank you all. The reason why we take a moment to remember and honor those we lost is to remind ourselves that when we have conversations like these, we are not talking about theories or concepts. We're talking about human lives. We're talking about the effects of what we don't oftentimes think of in the present, but that lasts for generations. And this conversation today will specifically be looking at how genocide as a crime is one that has far-reaching consequences beyond the moment and the present. And the people who suffer from it are more than just those who encounter it in the time, but rather it is felt far and wide and for years to come. This webinar emerges from a deep conviction that I hold and that many of our panelists and participants today hold. The genocide is not only a crime against the present, it is fundamentally a crime against the future. And nowhere is this more evident than in the way children are targeted and affected during genocide. In the 1948 Genocide Convention, the drafters made this clear. Acts such as forcibly transferring and removing children and imposing measures to prevent births were recognized not just as peripheral consequences of genocide, but as core methods of destroying a people's continuity. To harm children physically, psychologically, spiritually, is to attack a community's most sacred potential, its future generations. The 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda provides a devastating illustration of this. It not only claimed over 1 million lives, it also completely wiped out 15,593 families, according to the most recent censuses, totaling about 68,871 individuals. These are entire lineages, every parent, every child, every elder, erased from existence. Today and every year, we remember them. We keep their memories alive and speak their names, standing in for the biological relatives who are no longer present to do so. The plight of children during genocide is often under-acknowledged, and yet their suffering tells us something critical about the nature of these crimes. They are deliberate assaults on identity, memory, and possibility. They are meant not only to destroy lives, but to erase lineages, not only to silence voices, but to prevent new ones from ever being born. Today's conversation is personal for many of us here. It is the beginning of a broader project that looks at how children can be centered in our understanding of genocide and our efforts to ensure never again is more than just a phrase. I'm deeply grateful to our panelists, each of whom brings insight, scholarship, and lived experience to the dialogue. Thank you for being here, and let us bring this conversation and open it with open hearts, with urgency, and with a commitment to remembering and protecting the generations to come. Today, I have the joy of having with me Sandrine Mugenga-Irahunda. Sandrine is a survivor and a child of survivors, and a PhD candidate at Yale University, focusing on genocide, memory, and post-conflict reconstruction. in Africa and globally as well. A Rwandan scholar with deep personal and academic ties to the region, her work centers on how societies remember and narrate collective trauma. Dr. Zachary Kaufman, it's a joy to have you with us. He's a legal scholar and professor at the University of Houston Law Center with expertise in international law, transitional justice, and U.S. foreign policy. He has served in senior roles at the United Nations, U.S. government, and with courts that have been part of the reconstruction of Rwanda and has been a friend of Rwanda for many years. It's a joy to have you with us. Gustave Mukunde Mukurarinda is a genocide survivor, an author and youth mentor who uses his personal story, as documented in his memoir, to advance healing and education about genocide and resilience. He was 11 years old during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Omar Ndizeye is a genocide survivor, a researcher, and a peace builder who has worked for years on issues of memory and reconciliation in Rwanda. He is an author as well and plays a leading role in curating survivor testimonies and preserving sites of memory, including some of his most recent work with Inkuru Library, which I hope he'll get to share with us briefly about today as well. So as we open our conversation, I want to start with you, Zach. I just mentioned the 1948 Genocide Convention and how it talks about forcibly transferring children and imposing measures to prevent births as an act of genocide. I'm curious to know, why did the drafters explicitly sort of include these provisions? Why do you think that was important? And what does that reveal on how children are uniquely and deliberately targeted? And basically, speaking of that in general, in what ways is genocide not just a crime against the present, but rather one that affects the future?
Thank you, Ian. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be here with you and my dear colleagues and friends, Sandrine, Omar, and Gustav, as we discuss this incredibly important topic today of children and genocide, overdue topic. I would also add. Um, as Mr. Manzi has already, begun discussing, children are especially vulnerable during and after genocide because they're still so young and developing. Children are particularly susceptible to starvation, to disease, and a lack of sufficient housing and clothing. And given their age and vulnerability, children often suffer extreme physical and psychological trauma during genocide. After a genocide, if they survive, children's parents may be dead, leaving these children as orphans. And genocide orphans thus face further challenges in securing shelter, care, and any assets, if they exist, that their parents may have had. And these realities are reflected in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, also known as the Genocide Convention, which is formulated in response to the Holocaust. The two groups with the lowest survival rate in concentration and death camps during the Holocaust were the young and the old. Approximately 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered by Nazis or their collaborators during the Holocaust. Nazis massacred Jewish children in part because Nazis considered these children, many of whom were too young or weak to be used for forced labor, to be useless. Children, of course, have been similarly targeted during other genocides. During the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, an estimated 54%, so more than half, of the people who were massacred were children or other young people under the age of 24. In addition to being targeted for murder and extermination during the genocide, Tutsi children were also targeted for sexual violence, torture, persecution, and forcible transfer. During the genocide, Radio Television Libre Colline, also known as Hate Radio, repeatedly broadcast statements that incited and orchestrated the killing of Tutsi children. One of the popular statements was, quote, "He who kills a serpent should not spare its eggs," end quote. Another was, quote, "Didn't Paul Kagame and Fred Rwigema, the military commanders of the RPF, flee the country on their mothers' backs?" End quote, referring to Tutsi military leaders of the Rwandan Patriotic Front who left Rwanda for Uganda. The Hutu masterminds of the genocide thus directed their foot soldiers to kill Tutsi children and babies because they were considered equally subhuman as their parents and because they represented future threats. I've spent a lot of time paying my respects at the many genocide sites throughout Rwanda. One of the most horrific aspects of these genocide sites, such as the former Interama Church, are blood stains where Tutsi babies' heads were smashed against the wall. Moving to legal issues, unlike the legal definition of other types of atrocity crimes, the legal definition of genocide has remained unchanged since it was codified in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, the Genocide Convention. This treaty was opened for signature in 1948 and entered into force for its signatories in 1951, although many states didn't ratify the Genocide Convention until years, or in the case of the United States, decades later. The same legal definition of genocide that appears in the 1948 Genocide Convention appears, for example, in the statutes of all international criminal tribunals that have been created since 1948, including the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which is the ad hoc tribunal created by the UN Security Council to address the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and also in the International Criminal Courts statute, the world's first permanent international criminal tribunal. Every crime features two elements that must be proven to yield a conviction. One is the actus reus, and the other is the mens rea. The actus reus refers to the act or omission that comprises the physical elements of a crime. Mens rea refers to the mental state that constitutes the other element of a crime. In the legal definition of genocide, the mens rea, the necessary mental state, is, quote, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, end quote. In the legal definition of genocide, there are five actus reus, any of which can qualify as genocide. One of the five is, quote, killing members of the group, end quote. The popular conception of genocide is that it involves mass killing. And while that is usually the case, the other four actus reus that can qualify as genocide do not actually necessarily involve killing. As Mr. Manzi noted, two of the remaining four non-killing actus reus relate to children. One is, quote, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, end quote. In other words, stopping a group from having children. The other is, quote, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, end quote. In other words, kidnapping children and making them become part of another group. The legal definition of genocide thus reflects the fate of so many Jewish, Tutsi, and other children during their respective genocides, that children are especially vulnerable during and after genocide, that children are uniquely and deliberately targeted during genocide, and that children are targeted for their past, for their present, and also for their future. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. To sort of build off of that and to basically really just center this a little bit more. I think one of the questions you just pointed out that oftentimes when we think about genocide, we sort of think about it in one dimension or in one way, in one direction. I think what does the inclusion of children specifically in this convention tell us about the thoughts and the spirit behind making sure that it's clearly outlined that children can and are targeted by genocide and that they are not just incidental collateral victims? Why do you think this was particularly important, or why do you think, based off of the historical elements of it, that we needed to point this out?
Well, I think it's clear that from the Holocaust and forward, that children were specifically targeted as their own distinct group, and so the crimes that were perpetrated against them needed to be emphasized, to be highlighted, so that they could be prevented in the future, or at least try to be prevented in the future, and also so that accountability and attention could be brought to them. And so there's first the kind of retrospective concern of ensuring that those specific kinds of crimes are brought to justice. And then there's also the additional concern that children, of course, as we all know, represent the future. And part of the reason they are targeted is because they are the future. They are the future of that group that is the target of the genocide. And so paying special attention to children as a group is not only appropriate but necessary, and that's why it's integral to the Genocide Convention's legal definition of genocide, that the forcible transfer of children and the prevention of births of future children is are unique crimes that target the next generation, and in order to recognize and affirm that first of all, those kinds of crimes do take place and are part of a genocide that aims to eradicate a group, and also to seek justice for those particular horrendous offenses. Those specific kinds of crimes needed to be codified in the Genocide Convention.
Thank you for that. Before I move on to Omar, I would also like to correct quickly a misspoke during my introduction. Zach is the Yale graduate. Sandrine is at Johns Hopkins doing her PhD, and Zach is currently at the University of Florida. Omar, coming to you, Zach just mentioned Narama, for instance, a while ago. And I know in your experience as a genocide survivor, but also as an author, you oftentimes talk about the darkness of surviving in Yamata and your history as well. I want to come to you and ask what it's difficult to say this in one general term, but what was the experience of children in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda? And this not just during the genocide, but starting from before that and sort of coming down to 1994. How does this show us the children were central to the ideology and the plan of genocide, both as victims and sometimes as coerced perpetrators?
Thank you very much, Manzi, and I would like to thank my very good friend Zachary for very good insight that he shared. And for your question, since 2016, I am working on a research on memorials and memorization in Rwanda. It's a research that started with a personal story of Nyamata, as you mentioned. I wanted to document the story of Nyamata, a story that people don't see when they visit the memorials. It's an inspiration that came from various numerous visits that I had at that memorial, which is one of 265 genocide memorials in Rwanda. And one day when I was with my friend Samantha, like at the memorial, she asked me, like, what do you see when you are here? And obviously, when you visit Nyamata, there is a very beautiful garden. There is a tree, there are trees, there is old churches and new churches. There are priests, monastery, and the schools, the environment, the remains, the artifacts of victims. But for me, as someone who survived at that place, again, the story of Nyamata is us children sitting at the cemetery of Locatelli waiting food. It's been 3 days without eating. It's us children seeing parents, helpless without anything to give us. Some children who are young than us were crying. It's all this experience that I wanted to document. But as I worked with Professor Stephanie Wolf from Utah and Dr. Namari Debia, we traveled all along Rwanda. We visited 120 genocide memorials in Rwanda. We encountered stories. We interviewed the survivors and encountered the different stories. Among those 120 genocide memorials we visited, I would like to, when we went to Gashirabwoba, it's in Cyangugu, former Cyangugu, which is in the western province today. It's near the Congolese border in the west of Rwanda. So the story there at this killing site is that the killers selected boys and girls, women, girls. Women were taken to their own places, and girls, they were taken together along with women. But they decided to put boys aside, young boys aside. Theobald, who shared with us a story, with us this story, he survived because his mother managed to find a girl dress to give him, so that he was spared. The killers thought that he was a boy, he was a girl. At Gashirabwoba, the killers killed the boys and men, and then after they burnt all women and girls whom they had gathered in small houses outside the killing site of Gashirabwoba. Thinking about this story took us again to Rwamagana district in the Eastern Province, where we visited the Rutonde genocide, a killing site. It's a Rutonde logs. Here again, the killers separated women and girls and boys. Boys and men were put aside and they killed directly. Women and girls were taken, but different from Gashirabwoba, at Rutonde, women and girls were made sexual slaves. That means each killers, except the young girls, were killed right away there because they had nothing to do with them. But women and the girls of certain age were taken and turned into sexual slaves. This tells you that genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda was not just a campaign of killing. It was the killing itself. It's when you analyze these cases that you find a lot of elements. For example, element of culture. Separating boys and girls meant that in Rwandan culture, as a patriarchy society, that means the ethnic or the ethnic is given by a man or male. Killing boys was part of the exterminating the Tutsi, so that the Tutsi will never exist again. So turning women into sexual slaves had nothing to spare them. It's because in Rwandan culture, women doesn't give. They don't transfer the genealogy or the ethnicity. So ethnic belonging is given by a man or male. So this shows you that then children in this case are not a collateral damage. They were separated intentionally and killed at Gashirabwoba. And the same at Rutonde. Guess what? One is in Eastern Province and the Western Province. Again, this is additional to the other different evidences that are exist even before genocide, when you see, when you try to measure the intent of genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda, where if, for example, if you take the 10 Hutu commandment itself and took the 8th commandment, which says never have a mercy to a Tutsi. And this goes to what Zach said, different words, different rhetorics that were pronounced by perpetrators, which Zach mentioned the President Kagame's example. But we have also other examples where perpetrators would say, we shall kill Tutsis until our children will ask us how Tutsis were looking like. And this gives you an example that even children in this case were not spared.
Thank you for sharing that, Omar. That's deep and powerful in the sense that oftentimes it's not something that we think of, right? We're not thinking about children immediately when we think about this. And so with that in mind, I'm coming to you, Sandrine, and I would like to ask, as a scholar, right, of genocide and large-scale violence. In your experience, in your research, in your work, how are children's experiences typically portrayed? Do we see them in the literature? Do we see them in the discourse? What do we see when we look for it? And what does the absence of some of these stories oftentimes also tell us about the way we think about children within the context of genocide and other atrocities?
Yeah, thank you so much. And let me start by saying I'm very honored to be part of this such an important conversation. I think this is a really interesting and timely topic. I think in the academic discourse and even in the public discourse on genocide and mass atrocity, we tend to focus on two primary groups. So we focus on perpetrators or victims. Of course, this binary framework obviously oversimplifies the complex spectrum of different actors that are involved in the violence, like bystanders, rescuers, or resistors. But within this framework, perpetrators are portrayed as active agents of violence who often speak for themselves. And then we have the victims who are portrayed as passive recipients of the violence and are often spoken for. And so children are typically placed in the victim category, rightly so, because they are victims. And even when they're involved as perpetrator, it is always under coercion. So even though children's experience are acknowledged and studied, and there's many studies on different aspects, their own voices, I would say, are very rare and often absent from the literature. And so we study the children's experiences, but we don't often hear the voices of the children in the academic literature. I would say usually the humanitarian organizations have historically been the first one to bring attention to the children's suffering in the aftermath of genocide or mass atrocity. For example, in Rwanda, UNICEF and Doctors Without Borders were among the earliest to document the vulnerabilities of children and the suffering that they went through during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. UNICEF estimated that there were at least 60,000 to 85,000 unaccompanied minors in the country. And Doctors Without Borders did their own report, and they highlighted that at least 100,000 children had been orphaned or separated from their family. So these organizations that are on the ground are often the first ones to tell us what's going on with the children. And we see that even today with the different horrible conflicts going on around the world in Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza. You have Save the Children, UNICEF raising the alarm. So these are usually the first one to share what's going on. And so while the academic literature, as I mentioned, does engage with children's experience, we have studied their suffering, we study their displacement, we study loss of family, trauma. It is often done so through adult lenses, like through an adult perspective. In the context of Rwanda, we've done a lot of research on PTSD among child survivors. We have done a lot of research on intergenerational trauma and on the experiences of children who are born of rape, particularly their struggle for identity and belonging. All these studies have been done, which are really important. But again, I want to highlight that these are done from the perspective of the adults, from an adult lens. So what remains limited in the literature is that we allow children to speak for themselves and allow ourselves to see genocide through the eyes of children. It is extremely important to do that because I think once we see genocide and mass atrocity through the eyes of children, it reshapes our understanding and it forces us to confront the impact as more than just mass killing, but also to see that it is a violent interruption of human development, of potential, and of future, as you were mentioning. One of the most powerful example of how this can be done is through the example of Anne Frank, and I'm sure we're all familiar with Anne Frank. She was a 15-year-old who kept a diary documenting her life in hiding amid Nazi persecution. Once her diary was published, it gave the world a radically different understanding of the Holocaust because we stopped seeing the Holocaust as just statistics, 6 million, but we started seeing it through a child's reflection. And so when we center children's voices, we humanize the abstract. It goes from just being abstract to being human. And we also make space for healing because you're validating the experiences of the children. And it is crucial and really essential for individual recovery and for social reconciliation as well. If children's perspectives are excluded from our understanding, our collective memory is incomplete because we're lacking that perspective. And it can lead to narrative that fails to capture the full extent of societal devastation. And so there's a piece missing when we don't see things through the eyes of the children. Again, as I mentioned, it also negatively impacts the survivors because they don't feel seen and they don't feel that their suffering is validated, which can hinder their healing process and also reconciliation efforts. Neglecting this crucial aspect can also lead to gaps in policy. So when we're making policies and we're not taking this perspective into consideration, we might have gaps when it comes to mental health, education, and the social support that these survivors who are now adults but were children need. But before I conclude and end my reflection here, I do want to acknowledge that there has been a significant progress because many survivors have started to write about their experiences. So many survivors who were children during the genocide have started to write. And we have two on our panel today, Omar and Gustave, excellent books where they write from their perspective as children. So they've started to share their stories of what happened to them, their experiences, and have those narratives out in the world. We also have different organizations, the Rwandan, like Ibuka or Avega, that have also played a key role in documenting the narrative of children and their experiences and capturing that. And that is valuable resources for scholars that they can use to explore different range of topics. So even though the academic literature does not have the voices of children as much as we should have it in other parts where in the literature of the survivors, writing, and the different organizations, there is a lot of progress. So the information is out there. It is up to us, the scholars, to use it to explore the different topics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandrine. That was beautifully put. I like that in everything that's being said, we're also highlighting this aspect of responsibility, which will keep coming back over and over again, how different people in different spaces and different capacities have responsibilities, especially when it comes to the concept of Nera again, which we'll get to in a minute. But Gustave, speaking about writing, right? Sandrine just concluded with the concept of saying, we are seeing more and more books being written. We're seeing survivors talk about their experiences from the perspective of a child. And your book is one of those incredible and rare moments of reflection about the genocide from a child's perspective. I oftentimes tell people after reading your book, I feel like I am part of your family because I feel like I look at your family through your eyes, right? The nicknames you use for your siblings, the way you talk about the story of the family, the grandfather, and different aspects of it. And so reading the story of the genocide from an 11-year-old's perspective was an experience I'd never had before. And so I'm coming to you basically to ask what moved you to not just share your story, but to preserve the lens of 11-year-old Gus and to make sure that this story is told from that perspective, as opposed to the many different other angles you could have taken to tell it. And how has the experience and the journey of that 11-year-old you shaped the way you interact with the world and with young people today in your everyday life as a parent and different aspects? How do you see that come through to this day?
Thank you so much, Ian, and again, thank you for having me in this great discussion. So first, if I can say what really moved me just to write my story, to write it the way I did, and so I would say just being an orphan after the genocide, does that mean had to meet a lot of people from non-profit organizations like charities and a lot of journalists. Sometimes you'll be in class and then some journalists visiting the school and they'll be like, we want to talk to some genocide survivors, like orphans. I mean, they had to take you out of class and then you go talk to the journalist. And I mean, from a young age, I really did not like how they actually, let's say, because sometimes a journalist will be talking to you or any member of any charity, but you know, there's a place where they're trying to push the conversation. And most of the time it was really, I did not appreciate that. And from a very young age, I always try to correct. I always try to say the right thing. So sometimes they will ask you a question because you're even a child, but they're really trying to push you in this one angle. I mean, to a narrative they really want. And thankfully, I really could like notice that when I was a child, and I always felt like the need of talking. And especially the reason why I was meeting most of them is that I was good in French. I was kind of fluent in French. And also sometimes even the English, I could just put some words together, I could just have a conversation. And I always had that thing in me. Every time I feel like a journalist, I'll prepare myself to try to say something bigger that I can show you the situation. And I just grew up with that spirit. So that's probably what pushed me, what moved me to write and in the way I wrote. So coming to why did I choose to say that in the voice of an 11 years old? To be honest, I don't know exactly how that idea came, but I thought probably I wanted just to show the world what was going on in the head of a child during the genocide. I just wanted to share what I was seeing, what I heard, what I overheard, and how I was trying to process everything in my mind. So I did not get a chance to document like in a diary back then, but it was like put down everything that was in my mind during that time. And I believe that through that, actually people can understand the history of the genocide from the roots. Because I felt like I had very important stories I can tell people that can make them think or maybe try to look for more information about some of the events of our history. And I just felt I wanted to say that as a child because I didn't think I had any chance to say it as a researcher. And even if I could, probably wouldn't be what I did. So that what motivated me. And also my 11 years old self, as you asked, how did that 11-year-old shape, how I interact with people, or maybe everything I do? So maybe one of the reasons why I actually decided to write through that voice was also because I really missed that kid. I really missed that kid because I can say even me right now being able to write a book, it's not something I got from school. And sometimes I tell people that most of the things I really know, I learned that from my mom. So my first 11 years old of my life, really, I learned a lot from my mom. She was a very intelligent woman. And she had that way, and I was a very curious kid. So we really had that relationship that she was teaching me a lot of things. And it's at that age that I felt like actually I could do anything if I put my mind into it. So part of writing with that voice really was to revisit that kid that I say like, and when I look back at him, that's where I said that was the best version of me. So that's probably helped me to actually do that way. So thank you.
Thank you, Gustav. As we go on with our conversation, we welcome questions in the Q&A, as we mentioned. And one of the questions that has come through that I think is really important for us to address at this point, before we even move on, is the question of asking, one of the attendees asking, saying they sympathize with Rwanda and Tutsi families, they sympathize with Jewish families and the experiences of other communities historically. and basically asking, you know, have we considered to talk about what's happening around the world? Oftentimes people talk about the areas that they know of. Oftentimes people talk about Gaza or Ukraine because that's what they know. But we also know that it's true about Sudan. We also know that it's true about Eastern Congo and different other parts of the world as well, where we are seeing reasons for us to wonder whether never again truly means never again in many different contexts. So I'm going to pose the question this way to any of the panelists who would like to answer. How does talking about the story and the journey of Rwanda, how does talking about our experiences as Rwandans or different other communities historically make a difference? How does that matter for the people who are going through what Rwandans may have gone through 31 years ago, right? How does speaking and looking at history help us understand and deal with the present and maybe also prepare for the future as well? Why is it important? Omar, I might even come to you as well and ask, oftentimes we hear people say, why do we still remember? Why do we still bring this back? Why is that important?
Very good question, Manzi, and thank you so much. I also thank my colleagues who shared the insights, also the participants who are sharing the questions. If I would answer that question in one word, I would say that every conflict starts in the past and ends in the past. It's either in the Bible, Quran, or historical books, historical land. It's always about claiming something in the past. But again, most people, when they are analyzing conflicts, they tend to go binary, and they tend to analyze conflicts or genocide history or memorization in a good guy versus bad guy. But life is not always 1 + 1 = 2. Sometimes 1 + 1 = 15 or something else in life. And you would also see it today. And some of the questions here can also reflect that. But let me give you the example of Rwanda, the post-genocide Rwanda. The post-genocide Rwanda is functional because of 4 historical moments. One is July 1994, when the current government of Rwanda chose to call itself the government of unity. That means committing to bring perpetrators, former perpetrators, survivors, returnees. These are refugees, mostly Tutsis who were outside of Rwanda from, successively from 1959, 1963, and along 1994. And the Batwa people to form the same government, therefore, if you use this case, this solution doesn't tell us if there is a bad guy or a good guy in this functionality of this question, of this solution. But what we are seeing is that it worked. So the second moment that make the post-genocide Rwanda functional is the Urugwiro Dialogue. Urugwiro Dialogue, which happened in 1998, brought again political actors from Parmehutu of 1959 to all those who were in politics until 1994. I call it political reconciliation. Again, here, it's going to be one of the solutions which doesn't tell us if analyzing in a binary way works. But what we are seeing is that it is helping Rwandan society to function. The third moment, the third historical moment is Gacaca, which my friend Zachary mentioned. Gacaca, which started around 2000, it's going to bring Rwandans again from all those clusters, what we call social construct. Just also to tell you that in the post-genocide Rwanda, social constructs are changing. What Mahmoud Mamdani called the political identity are changing. Are coming from Hutu, Tutsi, and Betwa to become to returnees, survivors, perpetrators, rescuers, historical marginalized group. These are the political identities that are changed by what we are seeing. Like Gacaca is bringing all of them in a 12,000 court on the hills of Rwanda, just to revisit the past. You can call Gacaca transitional justice. You can call Gacaca healing dialogue, because all these people went through, revisited their past. What happened? The purpose was to find the truth, to know what happened. So the fourth moment is the Constitution of 2003, which was the first constitution after genocide, which, of course, then put the Rwandan society on the way we see it today. Why am I mentioning, or where am I coming from? I mentioned those 4 moments, is to demonstrate the importance of dialogue. Is Rwandan society functional? Everything works well? No. In the post-genocide, even in the societies that haven't experienced genocide, there is always conflict. But what we are seeing is at least a society is functioning. But is functioning because of dialogue. And the remaining challenges that the society is facing, they also need dialogue. But then, Manzi, it shows us that it's through dialogue that we revisit the past, that those who analyze the conflict either in Ukraine, in the Middle East, it's not important for me to always coming from accusatory perspective, because it doesn't help. In any conflict, there is no good guy, bad guy that helps. There is a need of a space for dialogue. And to conclude for this question, I just want to let you know that for me, I also define genocide as an absolute, an intent for absolute domination or absolute destruction. You see it in every case of genocide. It's banning books of, during the Holocaust in 1939. What does that tell us? It's to destroy the Jewish knowledge, and that's it's an intent to dominate, absolute domination, and also absolute destruction. So when we are analyzing conflict, for us to achieve never again, Manzi, we need to think about, to be mediators. We need to always be in the middle to bring people together to discuss. Just to take an example of Rwanda, and those 4 moments I mentioned that make society functional, it might have challenges, but of course, nothing will replace dialogue.
Thank you, Omar. I think you bring up something very important that I sometimes talk about. Is I oftentimes say one aspect of genocide that's sometimes different from other conflicts is that it brings destruction not just at a human level, but oftentimes even at an institutional and overall level in a country. And I can link that, Zach, as you reflect on this question of why do we remember, come to then the challenges that a post-genocide Rwanda had to deal with in the space of justice and reconciliation. I'll link that to a question from one of attendees here today, who's basically asking, as we talk about this binary look at victim versus perpetrators, at good versus bad, how do you navigate those waters when you're dealing with children? When children are victims, when they are survivors, when they're witnesses, but also when they're participants in the genocide. And to bring that in to say, how does the justice space then adjust to deal with minors in ways that, were never anticipated before? I don't think Gacaca, as it was used historically in Rwanda, ever had to deal with children. Somebody recently pointed out to me that issues that dealt with children and their behaviors were dealt with in a family, never in a courtroom. So how do you then adjust these spaces to be able to deal with children in all these different capacities and complexities?
Well, thank you for that question, Ian. And several of the questions I saw in the Q&A are related, so I hope my comments can try to begin to help answer those questions as well. So, as we've been discussing during genocide, children, just like adults, could be victims or witnesses or survivors or perpetrators. And also, like adults, children during genocide can be bystanders and upstanders and enablers. And so I'll focus my comments to answer your question and other questions on children as survivors and as perpetrators. So first, children as survivors. Many children after the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda were orphans. And many of these children found themselves in orphanages and foster families. In the 25 years I've been working on and in Rwanda, I've been so impressed with and moved by how many adults took in genocide orphans and made them part of their families. And these generous adults committed to rebuilding Rwanda even on such a personal level as their family. And that, I think, reflects a really forward-looking intergenerational vision of healing post-genocide. Moving to children as perpetrators, many criminologists view child perpetrators as partially victims, and that's been said on our panel already, and that they should be treated differently than adults by criminal justice systems. And after all, compared to adults, children are more often considered impressionable and immature and having brains that are still developing. So, given the ways that children differ from adults, child perpetrators, even if they're prosecuted and convicted for their crimes, are often accorded special attention and care aimed at their rehabilitation and their reintegration into society. The statute of the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, like the statute of the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, did not specify a minimum age for prosecution. And so the ICTR and the ICTY could theoretically have prosecuted children, but they didn't. In the case of the former Yugoslavia, that may have been because few children were reportedly perpetrators. And in the case of Rwanda, the prosecutor of the ICTR, the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the prosecutor affirmatively decided not to prosecute children. And that was, for the reasons that we've been discussing, that children are distinct and viewed as distinct as adult perpetrators. In contrast to the lack of a minimum age for prosecution in the ICTR and the ICTY, the statute of the world's first permanent international criminal tribunal, the International Criminal Court, explicitly does state that the court does not have jurisdiction over people who were under the age of 18 at the time of the alleged commission of the crime. So the ICTR and the ICTY chose not to prosecute minors, whereas the ICC was barred from doing so, and the result was the same. None of these tribunals prosecuted minors. So looking at the national level, Rwanda is reportedly the first country to prosecute people for acts of genocide allegedly committed while they were minors, specifically between the ages of 14 and 18. And so even then, under Rwanda law, these minors have been entitled to reduced penalties. So they could be convicted, but in acknowledgement of the distinctions between child and adult perpetrators, they're granted a mitigation in their sentences, whether it's through gacaca or through ordinary courts in Rwanda. And given that 14 to 18-year-olds can be prosecuted under Rwanda law, it also means that under 14-year-olds do not face criminal prosecution. So Rwanda and the ICTR were in agreement that people who were under the age of 14, at least, at the time of the alleged genocidal act, should face no criminal responsibility. So looking at the different approaches of the statutes of international criminal tribunals in countries like Rwanda, it appears that there is no consensus yet on exactly how best to balance, on the one hand, the best interests and special characteristics of older child suspects, and on the other hand, the need for post-genocide justice and accountability, given that, in the case of Rwanda at least, between 14 and 18 years of age, suspects could be prosecuted, but in the tribunal they weren't, even though they could have been. But there does seem to be consensus that younger child suspects, that is, those 14 years and younger, should face no criminal responsibility, and that's consistent across countries like Rwanda, as well as the tribunals, whether the ICTR or the new permanent International Criminal Court.
Thank you, Zach. Sandrine, coming to you as we talk about this, basically, I want to ask you briefly. We're talking about memory, we're talking about stories and how people are telling these. We're talking about the experiences of children, as we said. I want to know, in your experience and in your work, why does it matter who's telling the story? And I'm linking that to this idea of, why do we remember? Why is it important that we have people like Gustave and Omar and others who are writing these stories? Why is it important who's studying it, who's shaping the narratives around genocide and other mass atrocities in general? And what is gained and lost when the people with a direct connection to that history are absent in that space, are not actively participating in the academic and public discourse and taking part in these discussions?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think I'll start by sharing a little bit my experience, which is I grew up in Rwanda after the genocide. And although the genocide and the consequences were all around us, we didn't really speak about it in my family. I think it was just too painful for the adults to talk about. And I think the children kind of knew intuitively to not ask about it, because it was like an off-limits topic. So when I got older and started to want to know more about my country and my family history and what happened, the most readily available resources academically were written by Westerners. I found a lot of things written by European scholars or American scholars, and that's how I learned more about our history. And I think their work remains very valuable and important, and it taught me a lot, but it often felt abstract and not really connected to the human experience. And so it was not until I started reading Rwandan scholars and writers that I understood that there's some truth, there's some emotions, there's some complexities that can only be fully articulated by the people that have lived through these horrors or these experiences. And so that's, I think is why it's really important for those people who lived through it or who have that close connection to write their stories. One of the first Rwandan scholars that I encountered was this professor who was a linguistic professor in California. And right after the genocide, he returned to Rwanda and he documented what he saw, what he experienced. And it was the first time, I think, in the many things that I had read, that I had seen somebody put names. Like, he wrote names of the people that died. He put names of the villages he was in. And it turned out that one of the villages that he was from my grandfather's village. And so it felt more personal. There was more variation. like regional differences, names, and it was more human. And so it matters who tells the story because it holds power. Storytelling holds power, and it shapes our collective memory. It shapes the public perception, even policies. And so it's really important who tell those stories. So if we take an example, during the genocide against the Tutsi, many Western journalists described it as a spontaneous eruption of ethnic violence, rather than describing it as a carefully planned and systematically executed campaign. And so that framing had real consequences. So it is, if maybe more Rwandans or many other perspectives had been at the table in those spaces, maybe that narrative would have been challenged and different policies would have been put in place. So I think it's really important for those people that have historical ties to be part of the academia and talk about it and research it, because when they're not there, I think we lose the richness, we lose depth, we lose complexities and the nuances that only they can bring. I mean, if you're studying it as an outsider versus an insider, there's a difference. And so a lot of times we lose that if we don't have those people in the academy, like working on it. Also, it can be more abstract, as I mentioned, that you can feel more abstract and less human and therefore less accurate because it's not really a full representation of the things that happen. I think another thing I can add is that it also comes at the expense of the integrity of scholarship, because again, we are putting out things there that are not fully accurate because we're missing different perspective, whether it's perspective of children or perspective of the people that lived through this, being in academia and writing and researching it. Academic spaces have to value lived experiences as much as scholarly research. And so if we make room for survivors and their descendants, the younger generation, to be able to reflect and analyze together and co-create that knowledge, we're going to be better off because we're going to have a fuller understanding of these horrors. And I think personally, I think in the case of Rwanda, for example, those people that lived through the genocide, as they get older, I think there's an urgency to be able to capture and collect and preserve their memories, especially that some of them have not really shared. So if we're able to, the younger people, the younger Rwandan people doing that work, I think again, we'll be all better off because we'll have a better understanding. And this understanding shapes not only our memory, it also shapes policies that can make a difference and save people's lives.
Thank you, Sandrine. Just to sort of add to that, we had a question in the Q&A.
Can I add an element of culture to what Sandrine is mentioning? Because Sandrine is mentioning a crucial things, especially in research. And in this case, on Rwanda, the element of culture is also important because sometimes we misinterpret what we get, like the data we get, especially the qualitative data we get from field. Let's say, for example, when survivors says, in most survivors' stories, they mention cows. And very few people understand that when survivors mention cows, they are mentioning loss at the same level as human loss. And Rwandan society having less written, having, oral culture, this knowledge has never been shared to across different researchers, especially most Westerners who come to Rwanda. They may not be aware of this. When we were doing our research on the field, most survivors were telling us that here it's my home. Survivors were mentioning memorials. Sometimes these are graveyards, and people saying these are my home. And my colleagues, both with Western Heritage, they were questioning that. But myself, I was also understanding why they are questioning it until we start asking survivors what they mean when they say a graveyard is my home. Then they say, if I have issues, I come and talk to my dad who is buried here. And when I feel healed. But what does that mean in Rwandan culture, for example? Then we dig deep and found that in Rwandan culture, since death is not the end of life, the interpretation of death in Rwandan culture is a changing of status. So how about if you analyze missing this element? How about if you don't have all these elements in your hands, and it comes to what Sandrine called, integrity, academic integrity, I agree with Sandrine that there should be an exchange, but also having Rwandans, having survivors in particular in research, in academic dialogue and academic conversation helps us to capture all these small but meaningful cultural elements.
Thank you. That's very important to add on as well. I was going to say in the Q&A, one of the questions that sort of is coming up, and I'm coming to you, Gustave, is this aspect of saying, do we know of accounts of children's experiences in different contexts of genocide? I mean, the Q&A mentions Gaza, but we also, like I say, we have other experiences and contexts around the world where we're talking about Sudan and Eastern Congo and other elements, as we're seeing in Ukraine and elsewhere. We do have to acknowledge and recognize that something like the Diary of Anne Frank is very rare, right? It's very rare for us to have accounts of children's experiences in the moment, because when we're talking about this context, we're talking about survival. We're talking about actually living to see the next day. So the first thing people are doing is not necessarily keeping account of these, but with the existence of social media and the way the world has globalized, we also realize that we are seeing more and more voices of children speaking out in these spaces, in this context. We're seeing a bit more of their experiences, and it does what Sandrine has said. It also humanizes the topic. It brings us to a space where if we can't agree about everything else, let us at least be willing to agree about children and what that means and how we can talk about it. But it's difficult, right, to deal with these issues in the moment. But I want to come to you, Gustave, and ask, one of the other questions we have here is saying, as a parent, right, as somebody who survived the genocide, who experienced it, now you're a father of two, how does that come through in the way you raise your children? How does your experience as Gustave as a child, both positively and negatively, maybe come through in that space? And how do you address it when we talk about intergenerational conversations? We talk about trauma and justice and prevention of the future and memory. How do you approach these spaces and these conversations, not just as Gustave as a survivor, but also as a parent and a father? And I would add to that, how has that also shaped the way you interact with other people from around the world? One of the questions we were asked today was, talking about Rwanda today, what does that do for people with other experiences? I know in your case, you worked with young people from native tribes in Canada, for instance, and how that your experience also shaped your interactions with them. How does that come through? How do you see that, both as a parent and how you interact with people with other contexts?
Thank you so much. First of all, like I say, let me start with this as a parent, is that when I was writing this book, pretty much, I was thinking a lot about my kids. Even before I had them, I was talking about them. I was trying to find the best way to talk to them about our history. Not just my kids, but pretty much was in our community here, like where I lived in Edmonton. There was a growing, let's say, tension in a genocide survivors family. There was something growing because the kids were now growing and asking their parents about what happened. And of course, they have this internet like information that they get from here and there. And nobody knew what to do. And there was a little bit of an anxiety in our community. And every time I tried to write, like, I always thought about this generation. what's the best way to talk to them about our history. But on the other side, you just mentioned that I worked with the youth, and mostly the indigenous youth, like who are struggling with addiction and crimes and all this other stuff. So also working with the youth actually helped me to stay humble, and because like sometime it was a little bit personal after I started learning what really the indigenous communities went through in this country. So then I felt really, I was really close to them, and I had to either change, and I put down my ego and everything and learn how to talk to the youth. And it was not just a job anymore. It was more like we went through the same pretty much experience. Like them, they're experiencing that as probably like it was probably their great grandfather who went through the same thing we went through. But really, I felt like my experience could help them, and it did sometimes. It did for real because they trusted me, and I was lucky because, let's say, that was actually our job was they allowed us to actually use everything you can just to actually try to listen to these youth, whatever they want. So they really encouraged me to use my experience, and even sometimes using my story. And sometime when they found out, they will actually trust me even more. So, and all these just shaped me into like, now, let me find a way to talk to my children, talk to other children, Rwandan or non-Rwandans, just about our history. So that's probably what shaped what came out from Noma Project. So, but again, so this book, for example, you also ask, I think that what do you think? What do I think as it's going to bring as a contribution either to the justice, to trauma and everything? So first of all, the biggest, the biggest fear we have as a survivor is to ever think that what we saw can happen to our children or any other of the next generation. Not just like, let's say in Rwanda, but of course we think about that when you have a baby, anything that is good or bad that happened in your life, it always come like that. I don't know, as a genocide survivor, you have to think about the genocide. You have to think about our people who are, so that means if you have a baby, the first thing you think is like, what can I do to make sure this baby will never see what I saw? So I believe like the kind of work I did writing is part of the, I would say it's like a small contribution to try to prevent that to happen in the future. So, and of course, writing like a testimony, that's, I would say that one would probably, I think that is the first contribution more than research. Don't get me wrong. When I say research is because, you know, some people can invest a lot of money into research of probably, I heard recently our Minister of National Unity mentioned something. That is a scholar in Rwanda who actually is trying to, he's working on a project to try to check the DNA from the bodies that are in the memorial in Kisozi. So it's like really people can invest money. So into doing a research that pretty much is like, let's say, a genocide denying, like that will contribute to the genocide denials, like narratives. So that means research, people can do good research, but other people can do really bad with the bad intention, and they can still like really have the funding and everything. And that's even why, like, let's say if you go out like in mainstream media and everywhere, you will find actually genocide denial is pretty much has a spot. So sometimes our narratives are really hard to reach. Why? Because of some interests and economics, political and everything. So by us to write, even if it doesn't get too far, but a testimony, a genocide survivor testimony is like an undisputed, let's say, narrative. Usually that's what it should be. So I know we won't get where we want to, but by writing, by continuing to work on them, like doing in every style, if you want to talk to the youth, if you want to talk to the children, so write it. But we give a big contribution. On another thing, Sandrine mentioned something like one of the, let's say, things she read that really captivated her is what was written, and that there was a lot of names, name of places and everything. So when I was writing this book, where I had a publisher, and we didn't agree on how we're going to just write this book, so we had to cancel the contract. One of the things he told me is like, there's a lot of names in your book. So, and that comes back to what Omar said and always say, is like, we need to write, we need to tell our story the African way. So if somebody can look at my story and then say, really, we don't need all these names in your story, that means it's really hard to tell my story without mentioning all these names. There's a lot of things I have to mention for my story actually to make sense, but sometimes it does not fit, right? In the Canadian way, in the American way, right? So we say that by writing in my voice as an African, as an everything, that's probably what I believe we should do. And also that's how I believe that's the best way to talk to my children, to young generation, and to the future generation about what happened to us. But just like, we have to talk from an African perspective. It's gonna be hard, but we have to. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustav. I feel like we could go on with this conversation for days and days, and I want to be mindful of time as well. One of the things that has come up and that we might close with this conversation is this idea of never again. How do we even make sure that that's not just a statement, that's not just a slogan, that's not a prayer, but rather a promise. I want to sort of close our conversation today, and like I said, this could go on for long, and I'm hoping this is the beginning of a journey where we dive deeper into many of these aspects that we're introducing today, but that needs to be looked into deeper. I want to sort of close with this idea of saying, how do we make never again tangible and real, especially in a world where we oftentimes see many more agains after the other. One of the questions that we're asked is, how do we make conversations like these relevant to young people? How do we package it in a way that it's important for them to take part in and talk about? We've had somebody in the Q&A sort of ask, how do we respond to people who stand up to say that the accounts of survivors are not academic or they're not accurate because they are not written, like Gustav is saying, by certain standards, or because they were not recorded, because as the survivors were experiencing them, they were not thinking about recording every aspect, they were thinking about survival. How do we leverage the experiences of young people in the context of the genocide in Rwanda, but elsewhere as well, to make sure that the message today and the messaging is truly never again? And one of the questions that were asked as well is really, what is our moral responsibility to the hundreds of thousands of many children and young people around the world who are unfortunately experiencing things that should have truly been never again at the end of 1994. I'll start with you, Zach, and then we'll go around with your concluding thoughts, sort of addressing this idea of moving forward.
Thank you, Ian. As we all know too well, genocides seem to be proliferating today. Some have been mentioned already. I would also add there have been recent genocides against the Rohingya, against the Uyghurs, against the Tigrayans. There's no shortage of genocides today, and I'm under the view that we have every reason to believe that genocides will continue in the future, especially, for example, as we have more climate change that leads to scarce resources and land over which we have increasing conflict. So genocides will continue to be, I think, part of the human experience. We tend to violence, to to deal with our problems, and it's just a sad fact of humanity. And while we are recognizing the reality, I think, of humanity, sadly, I think that one of the reasons that we commemorate and remember the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda is not only to honor the past and to mourn, but also to learn lessons to apply today to contemporary atrocity crimes. And so I think I would leave you with some of the lessons that I take from the genocide against the Tutsi that I think are generalizable to all atrocity crimes, even those occurring right now, right here as we speak today. So I've been sort of formulating a list of lessons, and if you'll allow me just a moment, I wanted to share them with you very briefly. The first is that hate speech is dangerous. I think that's clear to everyone that hate speech during the genocide in Rwanda and in all genocides can incite and help to orchestrate genocides, and our leaders are incredibly I think, lax in their responsibility to curb their own rhetoric and also to help moderate the rhetoric of others. The second, I think, is that the second lesson, I think, is that atrocity prevention is possible. And there are ways to mitigate. This is something that should bring us hope. There are reasons to believe that we can mitigate genocide and other atrocity crimes. The third lesson, transitional justice is essential. We saw that in Rwanda and since the genocide in Rwanda for reconciliation and rebuilding after the genocide. A fourth is that tragically and predictably, sexual abuse is rampant. We've talked about how sexual abuse has been aimed at children and it's been aimed at adults. And this is an aspect of conflict that we need to continue to address as strongly as possible. A fifth, women's representation is crucial. It's clear that just as children are uniquely targeted during genocide and other atrocity crimes, so are women and girls. And we need more women in positions of authority to help guide leadership through difficult times. A sixth is genocide education is necessary. Too few people today remember genocides of the past and the lessons from them, and we need to promote education on genocide. A seventh is that political will is vital. Clearly, what is lacking is not the ability to intervene to help stop or at least mitigate atrocity crimes, but it's really just the political will. So young people and others need to call upon their officials, their representatives, to pay greater attention to atrocity crimes and to become involved. Three more. An eighth is that supporting survivors is fundamental, as we've discussed today. Child survivors pose special challenges because of their unique trauma, both physical and psychological, and also their financial situation. And same with adult survivors as well. Ninth, upstanderism is imperative. We all must be upstanders in the face of genocide. Genocides require bystanders, and upstanders do present the possibility of mitigating genocide. And then finally, as Ian Manzi had mentioned, never again. This is a platitude that is obviously completely unfulfilled. And many commemorations end with calls to never again, but as Ian mentioned, we continue to see genocides again and again. And so what I would, hope is that what we actually need to do is to make this a reality to the extent possible, and no longer a call for sort of these hollow affirmations of never again, but to demand that our leaders actually see it through. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandrine.
Yeah, thank you for this conversation and this question. I think to echo what Zach was saying, we're living in deeply troubling times, and genocides are all around us. The genocide, unfortunately, are not a thing of the past. They are happening in the present. And many children in many parts of the world are experiencing extreme violence. But I think my concluding thought would be a quote that keeps me going from Angela Davis. And it's a quote that says, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time." I think it's easy to lose hope in the face of the many genocides we see and the many mass atrocity and mass violence that we see. But I think we really have to act as if it was possible to create a genocide-free future, because that's what we really must do. And so I think the Never Again pledge, which has really become yet again over and over again, it compels us to speak out against the horrors that we see. I think we have to refuse to turn a blind eye and be silent when the most vulnerable among us are enduring so much suffering and humiliation. And so many people in the Q&A have brought up Gaza, and there's also Sudan, and there's also so many other places in the world. And so we have to, personally, I think Never Again means that we have to speak out. That's the first step. Because silence, when we are silent, we allow genocide to proceed, we allow the mass atrocity to proceed and to be perpetrated. So we must speak out for the children. I think it is the first step to protect them, and we really have to think that it is possible to transform the world, to make it a genocide-free world. It's not easy. It might take time, but that is our call, and that's what we must do. And it all starts with speaking out.
Thank you, Sandrine. Omar?
Thank you, Manzi. For Never Again to be achieved, we need to understand that denial is not the last stage of genocide. Last stage of genocide is transformation. Therefore, this gives the responsibility of everyone, in humanity in general, scholars, political actors, others, to work to transform post-genocide societies or post-conflict societies to ensure that the elements that led to those societies to genocide are transformed positively. Otherwise, if we discuss post-conflict societies as if genocide continue, it continue to fuel the conflicts. Even you find that most of post-conflict societies also goes, in a cycle of violence, and therefore each conflict or each genocide case cause humanity to grow. My former professor who trained me in conflict transformation used to tell us that conflicts are not bad. Conflicts are bad when they are violent, but conflict helps human beings to grow. For example, in Rwanda, there are things we no longer play with, especially, for example, play with ethnic backgrounds, pronounce them in the public like we used to do. Society have grown up because we have seen that those things are dangerous. So we need to understand that then transformation is a stage that requires all of us as humanity to really put seriousness and invest ourselves in that. Also, when we talk about genocide and the conflict, in a simple word, we are talking about otherlings. It's otherlings effects. Genocide goes to, it's an othering that goes to extreme, but every conflict is about othering. How do we see other? How do we see other? So even some of us who consider that we are peace builders, we need also to always check on ourselves. How do we see others? Because that's how genocide starts. Genocide starts from a mind. when you think about it, the policies that led to genocide against Tutsis, not all of them had bad intention. But for example, when you think about, for example, the reform of 1929 that decided the Hutu and Tutsis, that divided the Hutu and Tutsis, it was an economic reform, socio-economic and administrative reform that created almost 100 years after a genocide. So we always need to question things we do and understand that genocide is also about the power. It's about the power relation. It's about competition. So, Manzi, when we talk about never again, and you see today, for example, in academic world, a debate, people questioning whether what happened in Rwanda is a genocide against Tutsi or Rwandan genocide. It tells you that then there is a competition, there is that power relationship in each relationship between human beings. What matters then is it's not to say that this debate should not happen. It should happen. But what matters is always to understand the importance of space of dialogues. Human beings need spaces of dialogues. If there is something that United Nations can do for us, is to give us space. It's to bring, global South, global North spaces so that they can understand each other. They can share knowledge. So knowledge sharing that leads to behavior change. It's what I'm seeing as a solution. Of course, promoting listening to understanding each other, empathy, and which will lead to trust. And that's how we'll build our global village where we belong each other and understand each other. And that's probably how we shall achieve never again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Omar. Gustav, you can close us out.
Thank you so much. When it comes to never again, I'm gonna speak from a perspective, from a storyteller's perspective, but at the same time, also from the experience I had I went through, especially in this journey of writing, because that shows probably why it's really hard. Because never again, for it to happen, the truth has to go out, and I believe that the way I would say, Omar just said something about the behavioral change, right? So in my opinion, from what I experienced, it's really hard for, let's say, storytellers from the Global South to really have their narrative respected. So there's always this thing here in the West. Of course, like if we talk about never again, that means it has to be global. It's like the word that stand up and say, this should not happen again. Because genocide is not just like a problem like for Rwanda from or any other place where it's happening now. It's our responsibility. So if we want to really have never again, like a real thing, it has to be, everyone has to participate, starting mostly from those who really set up the tone. And from what we see, it's like our narrative, even as a genocide survivors, as people who really experienced all of these things firsthand, is not respected. There's always that feeling that this is not how you should do that. So this is how we do it. And remember, it's from that place that really set the tone. So I remember, again, it's another experience I had with my publisher. There's a time they told me, we really need to write something North American kids can understand. And every time they presented to me what they think North American kids could understand, in a few words, this is how it looked like. It's like really the narrative should be on the 6th of April, there's a plane crash. And the next thing, there are people that are killing each other, which means really, if you look at it, it's like these people are crazy enough to start killing each other just because of the plane crash. And then this is the kind of story North American kids can understand, is that they will just take me as an 11 years old, they will really create a superhero, a little superhero that is actually going through all this craziness. Only at the end, this little superhero will find himself in Canada as a Canadian, which is from hell, heaven. That's exactly how I can say in a few words the narrative that I was imposed to do, right? So that means for the next whatever years, if my book, let's say if I was able to write my book in that way, that means Canadian kids, including my own children, they will never understand what a genocide is. Because that story, that narrative really it's a narrative to tell people this is how Africa looks like. These people are crazy enough to just do this. But look now what happened if one of them arrived in this side of the world. So I just shared my experience, and that was a little painful. But on the other hand, that brings me back to genocide denial today, which is also a stage of genocide. I think that is happening in front of everybody's eyes. So for other people, genocide denial can be debated, it's not this, it's not this. But for genocide survivors, like adding insult to injury. So every time we see this, the same rhetoric that was like used before the genocide, even as children. That's how we actually, somebody asked me a question, how did I switch from being a child and all of a sudden just start running, like protecting myself and my sister? It's because we were prepared for that. Everything that was said on the radio, everything we saw in the community, at school, everything, we were prepared. So the day my parents told me, just save yourself, I knew I was going to do that because I was ready. So come back, what I wanted to say is like, for never again to really be true, there has to be a change of behavior. It has to be, let's say, the humanity, like, let's say, people, like the activists, they have to understand now. They have to start to respect the other narratives that are not only from this part of the world. And the scholars can actually do a lot of work about that. That's I say it should be from the scholars to really help the world to understand that. And if we come together, we all respect each other in that way, so probably we can achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustave. Thank you all. Thank you, Zach, Sandrine, Omar, and Gustave. Thank you to everybody who joined us this afternoon for this powerful conversation. And I truly hope that this is the beginning of a longer and deeper journey of looking at genocide through the eyes of children and what that teaches us and tells us about pre-genocide, during the genocide, and post-genocide efforts towards reconciliation. We thank you all, and we wish you a wonderful afternoon. And for anybody who needs more information and details around this, please visit the Collaborative's website, and you'll see more details, and we'll be sending out a recording of this once it's ready. Thank you all again. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.